Welcome everyone to this launch of the Copyright Management Guidelines by the European Copyright Community. Today it will be my colleague Fred Saunderson, who is the Rights and Information Manager at the National Library of Scotland, and who's also the chair of the European Copyright Community Steering Group, and the person who has done the most amount of work on these guidelines. So thank you so much for this, Fred. And myself, Ariadna Matas, Policy Advisor at the European Foundation. So we'll be recording this meeting and we'll make it available online on European Pro afterwards. The way we'll use the time today is mostly, well, a couple of introductory words, then and a bit of a warm-up exercise on Menti to understand who's on the room and what your interest is in with regards to copyright management. And then I'll hand it over to Fred for a presentation on why we decided to create these guidelines, an overview of the guidelines and the content so that you get familiar with the areas in which they support you in copyright management, and then an invitation to review and give feedback from what you will have heard today and later on as well, and sometimes for questions. In principle, it should not take more than 1 hour. It might be shorter, also depending on how much appetite for discussion there is. A quick note also that the guidelines were to some extent based or inspired by some pre-existing resources. They are linked to at the bottom of the guidelines, and we also invite you to check them out if you're interested. Their scope is slightly different from the guidelines, and they might go into a bit more detail in certain areas, so they can be useful complementary resources as well. So it's mostly the suggested procedure by the Collections Trust on rights management and a paper or toolkit on finding the public domain on copyright review management system. So other than these two sources that we found for inspiration, most of the content of the guidelines were developed by the members of the European Copyright Community Steering Group. So the ones you see on the screen: Fred, who chairs the group, Karin, Marina, Andrea, Hande, Bart, Annie, Timo, Anna, and myself. They were, our expertise comes from some from the research sector, some from working in cultural heritage institutions. So the input was mostly from members of this group, with also then a consultation phase out to the broader copyright community that many of you, I think, are part of. So before we get started with a deeper dive into what these guidelines are about, we wanted to start warming up. We wanted to start warming up to understand where your interest lies in this area. So if you can all go to menti.com and add in the code 88783001. The first question is really, really simple, hopefully. So code 88783001. And yeah, the question is, do you work at a cultural heritage institution or advise a cultural heritage institution? And we're particularly interested on that because those of you who work at a cultural heritage institution are the ones who can potentially benefit from the management guidelines. So we've got 32 people in the room. I'll wait for a few more answers to come in. Okay, but I think there's a good representation of people who might be able to then use these guidelines. I'll go over to the next question. How confident do you feel about copyright management in general? And that's a concept that we'll probably dive deeper into in a moment. But from what you might think copyright management consists of, if you already do that at your own organization, what would you say is your level of confidence in managing copyright? We've got 18 answers. Okay, I think it's 3.4 out of 5 is not too bad. So that's, I think there's some things we can learn from people in this room as well, also as we might develop the guidelines further. last question before we go into the guidelines. How confident would you say your organization is in copyright management? Are there adequate systems in place, for instance? So not just you, but then overall your organization, do you feel is at a good place in managing copyright? So far, it seems to be slightly lower than the personal confidence in copyright management. Okay, so that's very useful info for to understand who's in the room. So I think from here, I'll hand it over to you, Fred, to start walking us through the guidelines themselves.
Great, thank you so much, Ariadna. So, well, really good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think that was a perfect illustration, actually, of exactly what we're working to and hoping to help out with here. Seeing that there's within the small set in the room today, a reasonably strong confidence with copyright management among yourselves. You know, not fives, and I didn't put myself as a five. I think there's always more to learn, but a reasonably high number, and markedly, you know, not bottom, but a lower number for the organizations as a whole. And I think that's really useful to hear. I think that chimes exactly with what we're hoping to help with these guidelines. So with that being said, I wanted to start off by explaining why we wanted to develop these copyright management guidelines. And this is the preamble that we've developed for the copyright guidelines. Really explaining that the aim is to support best practice in copyright management in cultural heritage organizations by highlighting the steps that the organization can take with an ultimate goal of developing a harmonized approach to copyright within that organization. So that's the key objective we felt here, was the key rationale and the key need was ensuring that each organization, each cultural heritage organization kind of has a conscious understanding of copyright for itself and is making a harmonized and joined up approach to copyright management across all the different sort of activities and facilities that it has. So the guidelines focus on establishing adequate workflows for dealing with copyright and collections management, providing sufficient copyright support or knowledge on copyright, and integrating copyright into the activities and projects of the organization. So the sort of key three strands that support that ultimate goal. So we felt that there was this gap, which has been nicely illustrated by the Menti responses just there, between the people within organizations who are either copyright experts or have nominated by themselves or by others for being the sort of point person on copyright, or just have a knowledge and an understanding of copyright. And a gulf between that and the wider organizational sort of awareness and buy-in, if you like, to an approach to copyright, and a need to sort of help bridge that gap and bring organizations, help you bring your organizations more up to a harmonized approach to copyright, an overall encompassing approach to managing copyright that's quite harmonized and joined up. So that's the rationale for the guidelines. And now I will just provide you with a really brief summary and overview of how the guidelines actually work, and in order to address that overall objective. So as I was kind of alluding there, the guidelines are structured around the sort of the diagram that you can see on the right of the screen there. So everything within the guidelines is working towards what we call the ultimate goal, and the top level goal of the guidelines. It's not the ultimate goal of everything, but the ultimate goal of the guidelines is to have a harmonized approach to copyright across your organization. And I'll start to dig into what that actually means as we go through some of the detail. And we've broken this down into supporting layers. So we said that in order to reach the ultimate goal, the first step is to ensure that you have a harmonized risk appetite, an approach to risk within your organization in terms of the copyright. We think this is a really fundamental bedrock to managing copyright across collections and across activities of cultural heritage organizations. Copyright isn't a certainty in many ways. It's a really complex area of law and practice, It's hugely diverse in terms of the formats you're dealing with, in terms of the age of material, in terms of the amount and quality of information you have available about, for example, copyright status or the ownership of copyright. And it's very, very difficult to consistently and constantly be certain about matters of copyright. Simply because, copyright lasts so long. It normally lasts for decades after a creator of a work dies. And because it's an automatic right, so it automatically arises. So there's no register of copyright owners the way you might get with a trademark or a patent, for example, in other sort of intellectual property systems. Or even sometimes you might get with authorship of works, where you might, not always, but often get details of who created a work. And of course, you don't always get that. Well, copyright is an intangible property right that automatically arises and lasts for sometimes well over 100+ years. It can be extremely difficult to manage with certainty. And so we think it's fundamental that risk and a risk understanding has to come into this, because you will fundamentally be dealing with uncertainty. And so we felt this was the first big and important objective into reaching a harmonized approach, is to understand and accept that there's a risk element to copyright, and then to sort of grasp that as an organization and agree how you're going to tackle copyright and what your appetite towards copyright risk is, and develop an approach. And then to split that work up into sort of more tangible phases. The guidelines are split into 3 phases of work that we recommend or we suggest you follow through, and which we'll explore in a second in detail. So as I've just said, the first sort of objective that we recommend you follow within the guidelines is getting that harmonized approach to risk management within your organization. So our first recommendation in the guidelines explains that evaluating risk and risk appetite, considering whether other tools are more appropriate to mitigating risk in addition to copyright. In other words, not using copyright for everything. So it's really about understanding the realities and limits of copyright. And basically what the first section of the guidelines do is talk through our recommended steps to developing, to meeting this objective, to developing a harmonized approach to risk and copyright within your organization. So then, as I said, in order to support that approach to risk, and in the ultimate goal of having a cognizant and harmonized approach to risk within your organization, we've broken the actual core work that we recommend doing into these phases, which are each broken down into sort of sub-objectives, so specific objectives. 4 objectives under the first phase and 2 under the second and third phases. And I've summarized them there, but I'll talk through them now in more detail. And before I do this, is just to highlight what these actually look like. If you've not looked at the document, at the guidelines yet, and we'll give a link to the actual document at the end of the presentation. But basically, yes, we've broken down the work into recommended phases of activity, which are divided into specific objectives. And for each objective, we tell you the objective, and then we tell you our kind of recommended steps to get you there. And in most cases, this is about describing the workflow that we recommend is followed in pursuit of that objective, what sort of people in your organization you'll need to be involving, and which sort of people you need to be informing of your activities, who needs to be actively participating in reaching the objective, and who maybe needs to be aware of the fact that you're working towards this objective, but doesn't actually maybe need to have an active part in it. What things you maybe want to document, so what you actually want to record as part of reaching this objective, how you might want to document that, and some sort of tips about how to really start the discussion around reaching this objective. So this is quite high level. We're only using a few words for each, a few lines, a few bullet points for each of these. And this is targeted at cultural heritage organizations, really in quite a wide range. You might be a very large organization or a very small organization, an organization made of many parts, working on different sort of structures and so on. So we have tried to keep the language very high level in general, but you might have to adapt a little bit, and we particularly think about the likes of who to involve and who to inform. We might be saying, for example, as you say here, your access, communications and marketing colleagues. You might not have those people. You might have huge teams that do those. You might have those activities looked after by a parent organization. There's lots of different ways that this can sort of fall. So it is a guideline, but it's generally thinking about the sort of top level ways that we think these can best be pursued. So that's how it's sort of structured. And if I then talk through the specific phases, it sort of more individually and more specifically. So as I said, the first phase that we recommend is sort of setting your foundations. And I really like, just to go back, we've got this sort of this idea of the tree image that you can see on this slide here, which is kind of through the guidelines. And I think that's quite a nice illustration. We're talking of starting at the foundations, at the roots, really embedding sort of copyright and the importance of copyright in your organization. We think is the absolute fundamental. We've got more objectives under this phase of activity than the others. I think this is absolutely key. So we recommend that there are sort of 4 objectives that you should be seeking to meet when you're setting your copyright foundations. So the first of these is around the acquisition process. And so we're saying, as far as possible, to obtain copyright information, licenses and copyright transfers, if applicable, at the time of acquiring collection material. So starting about the collections workflow here, and again, if you go back to Ariadne's point at the beginning about where we've sort of taken inspiration and things like the collections trust sort of framework, which is a much broader collections management framework. So we think about the process here, and the first process probably being the acquisition of material, and doing as much as you can to acquire knowledge and perhaps rights themselves, acquire knowledge about copyright at the point that you're acquiring material. The second objective then being to document and use collection material. So about the documenting and using of collection materials. So record copyright information about your collection materials and your incoming loan materials. Keep those records up to date and ensure the visibility of copyright information and licenses. So that's the maintenance of collections. And just really stressing that maintaining copyright information and documentation of copyright information is as important as maintaining any of your other collection records. The next objective is around digitization and reproduction. So this might not happen in all cases, of course. You might acquire material that is never digitized or reproduced, but where it is, and where you do that, ensuring that copyright in reproductions is clear with those digitizing the content. So ensuring that you do have the right processes in place to allow you to reproduce material, and that you obtain or clear or understand the logic of any rights that might arise in that process. And then finally, in this stage, we have a recommendation around digital access and reuse. So maintaining clear policies on copyright and access to reuse from your collection materials, and making guidance available on copyright or linking to existing guidance. This is about, you can see that collections workflow again there, from the point of acquisition all the way to the point of access, making sure that copyright is plugged in at each of those phases. So we're making recommendations about how you can reach those objectives at each stage of these. So those are setting your foundations, and I think those are, if you're going to take away anything from today, I think it's about looking at the foundation stage. There's a huge amount in these guidelines through the different phases, but I think the most important part is your foundations. Those solid roots are fundamental, and if you can start to take the steps towards or reach these 4 objectives, primarily, I think you'll be your organizations will be huge way forward in terms of sort of copyright assurance and grounding than you might otherwise be, but they obviously can go further. And so we talk about the next phase being expansion. So once you've got your roots in, you can start thinking about maybe the trunk of the tree, and you're building upwards and you're starting to expand and grow. And we've got 2 objectives that we recommend striving for at this point, once you've reached those foundational sort of benchmarks. The first is supporting your staff. So ensuring that staff in your organization have enough training and support available. So you or your colleagues who are the copyright experts might have fantastic copyright information and access to information about copyright or copyright support available from peers elsewhere. It's really important to embed that within your organization and your staff, so the people who are working with their collections, who are working with access, that they have confidence in copyright. It doesn't mean that they need to be copyright experts, but that they have the ability to gain copyright knowledge that they need to access guidance or to access training materials. And the second objective that we recommend at this point is supporting the administration. So we mean by this is senior management understand the importance of dealing with copyright adequately. So I think this again is really important if you want to really embed copyright and start to sort of underscore the importance of copyright to your activities as an organization. It's not just that your colleagues and yourself need practical understanding of copyright and ability to get guidance and support. It's that your senior managers, the people with the purse strings, the people who make strategic decisions, understand, first of all, that copyright exists, what copyright actually means for their strategic objectives and for their activities, and that they grasp the significance and understanding and importance of copyright, because that's the only way that they're ever going to resource it. So I think this is really, really fundamental, and I think it's key to that word expansion there. If we want our organizations to grow and to be able to make, for example, bolder moves with more contemporary material and really push the boundaries with content and clear more rights or take greater risks or involve more dynamic forms of content in a safe way in terms of copyright, we need our senior leadership to understand all the fundamental role that copyright has, and have them on board so that when we go and ask for resources for a project or for an activity to clear rights or to obtain copyright permission or to invest in people who will look at rights when we acquire material. All of that requires investment, so we need our senior management, our senior leaders to understand the role and importance of copyright in all of the activities of cultural heritage organizations. So getting them on board, getting them on side, getting them informed is fundamental. And it's a different angle from simply practical information about copyright in sort of training sense. It's really about getting them to grasp the importance and getting them to question, in every project, is copyright being resourced? Am I putting enough resource into copyright? So again, we have recommendations on how you can reach that objective. And then the final phase is integration, and I suppose you could think of this as sort of the leaves and the new shoots and the branches of the tree, if you like, for that visual metaphor we have. And this is really going the furthest here then. And once you've built your foundations and you've sort of built your solid trunk and you've expanded on your foundations, you can start to integrate these activities and integrate the work that you're doing. So on the first hand, you've got short-term integration. And making sure that copyright requirements of every activity and project are assessed during the planning stage. So I don't know if you're anything like me, but you've probably encountered projects or activities that are planned and integrated and developed and maybe resourced. Maybe they're budgeted, maybe they're really talked about, quite boldly, quite big. They're big activities or the small activities. And when is copyright mentioned? When is resource thought for copyright? Is it being thought about right at the beginning? Is it being planned in? Is it happening quite late in the day? So short-term integration goal objective that we're recommending is make sure that all of these activities and projects are having copyright as a key stakeholder, as a key activity, as a key resource to think about at the very early planning stage, at sort of the incubator stage. There might not be a lot of copyright activity. There might be none, really. It might be a very straightforward activity dealing with all public domain material, nothing much happening that involves copyright. And that's great, but it's important to think about it, much like many other resource implications are thought about in the planning stages of activities. So that's a short-term integration. And as you can see, that's really, that's possible at other times, but that's so much easier to do if you've got that senior management buy-in to the importance of copyright, if you've got some training and knowledge available across your organization about copyright that we talked about in the previous page, and if you've been gathering and recording the copyright information that we talked about in the foundation stage, you can see how it sort of builds. And then the final objective that we recommend is around long-term integration. So ensuring that adequate copyright resources are allocated to activities and projects. So this goes beyond just making sure that it's in the planning stage and making sure that it's just a bread and butter routine part of all of your organization's projects and activities. Copyright is a key strand, is a key stakeholder, and is resourced when required, and is a fundamental to a project. And projects don't and can't advance beyond a point at which they become unviable from a copyright perspective. That is really integral to your activities, that copyright considerations are made and resourced. So before I go on to talk about the next section, I just wanted to sort of recap there. That's the structure that we've got in the copyright management guidelines. It's a 9-page document, so it goes into some detail about each of these objectives, following the structure I showed you on the earlier slide, that horizontal structure where we recommend the steps to take and who to inform to reach each of these objectives. Our view is that if an organization steps through these processes, starting at the foundation stage, working through those, then the expansion, and then the integration phases. And if you can get through all of those, you will be reaching that ultimate goal that we have of a harmonized and sort of integrated and robust approach to copyright within the organization that might make all of our lives a bit easier as copyright sort of experts and practitioners. So that's the sort of structure of the copyright management guidelines. That's how they're set up to hopefully help you to start the conversation with the organization. And we're hoping that they can be, you know, a simple template guideline for you to start working with, and something that you can maybe take to your teams or to your leaders and say, look, this is important. I think this is something we might want to follow. Do you want to go ahead and work through this? Maybe start you with a mapping exercise as well. You know, where are the gaps? You might have some of these in place. You might have really good acquisition processes in terms of copyright, but really lacking on, you know, copyright documentation, for example. So hopefully this will also help with that gap analysis and that mapping exercise. So those are our hopes as the copyright community, that these will be guidelines that will be useful in a few different ways for you. That said, we would really love to get your feedback about the guidelines, about how useful you find them, about how applicable you find them. This is our, so sorry. Got a dog I'm looking after. He does like a bit of a bark. I'm so sorry. He's done very well so far. This is the first version of our guidelines that we've produced. We don't think it'll be the last. We really want your feedback. We want to understand where this is useful, where there are gaps in these for you. So we will be developing and expanding these and improving these over the years. So if you do make use of these and you find gaps, or you have questions, please get in touch with us, copyright@europeana.eu. Or even if you just find it really helpful, you want to tell us a success story, we would love to hear that as well. That's really helpful information for us to understand that this is very useful. Yes, my dog is very pleased with the guidelines. He's just iterating how pleased he is that there's such an important structure available for him and his copyright management objectives. So yes, we'd really welcome your feedback at any time. But equally, if I can get the slides to progress. Sorry, can I get back to you, Ariane? Yes. So equally, we'd like to get some feedback and some thoughts from you just now. Over to you, Ariane.
Thanks, Fred. Yes, so there's some time for questions as well, but again, if you'd rather share some initial feedback through Menti, we've got a couple of questions prepared for you. The first one is on the screen. Do you think your organization could benefit from a more harmonized approach to copyright management if it's not yet the case? So there's a possible answer, which is we already have that in place. And if you do, we'd also be interested to learn about your approach. So far, I guess, yeah, mostly yeses. I don't know yet, which is also very normal because you probably need time to digest some of the information. I'll give it a little bit more time. And if anyone is struggling to get into Menti, you should just go to menti.com and use the code that you see at the top of the screen, 88783001. But that's already very interesting to know. Maybe moving on to the next question, which is an open-ended question, so you can type your answers. We would be curious to understand if you were to adopt some of the recommendations in these guidelines or go through some of the steps, what difficulties do you think you might face when trying to implement some of these approaches into your organization's workflows? So for instance, do you think you would have difficulties into convincing certain colleagues of putting certain measures in place, or of convincing senior management, for instance, or resources? That's also, of course, an important one. So yeah, resources, change. I guess a change in mindset, or yeah, changing some practices if the organization is used to a particular way of doing things. So maybe I think that also helps us understand what we could do next to support you in adopting some harmonized approaches to copyright management. So that's, yeah, really interesting to know that mindset. Adapting to change is something that you would maybe find difficulties with. Complicated matter. It is indeed. Indifference from management. Yeah, and working across departments or generating sufficient awareness across the organization. If you're one person dealing with this, how do you convince the whole organization that this is important and that they should also be caring about it? Yeah, it's true that in the guidelines we say work with that person, inform that other person. We don't say how you might try to convince that person that this is important. It might be something we can maybe share through case studies or resources. Okay. So, last Mentimeter question. Are there areas that are not covered in the guidelines that you would welcome some guidance on in the area of copyright? And we are aware that we haven't given you a full overview of everything that's on the guidelines, so it might be difficult to tell, but if anything comes to mind already that you think would be, it would be very useful for you to have guidance on, you can drop it on Menti. I'll take the no answers as everything is covered. Okay, convincing management indeed. Yeah, so that's a very good one, as we were saying. I would like to keep this slide open. Okay, some other answers are coming in. Who to start? How to start? Okay, where to start from? Yeah, maybe how to put these guidelines into practice. Yeah.
I think that's a good question, because I think if you're an organization that has a copyright person, yeah, that's maybe a person who is obvious to start. And if you're not, who is the person who's going to kickstart all this? Is a really good question. Yeah, I mean, again, it's not something we really answer, and it can be quite tricky to kind of decide.
In particular, when these questions pop up in a context of projects that have a start and an end, and that you like, I guess in the context of a specific project where there's a very concrete need, you might be able to make the case to some extent. But if what you're trying to change is, there is no urgency, but you think it's a long-term change that is necessary, then you still, like, you have the additional homework of raising momentum in the organization of something that some people might not see as a priority.
Yeah. I think to some extent, yeah, I mean, you'll see, I suppose, for your own cases, and maybe it won't be, but hopefully some of these questions are, they're coming up on the screen here, are addressed to an extent in the guidelines. So, you know, we've got things like how to, recommendations on how to start the discussion for each objective, for example. So as I said, they're going to be really high level and general, because they're aimed at lots of organizations and they're really short. So they're not going to be hugely detailed, but possibly a small sort of window into a start, how to maybe start conversations on specific objectives about, convincing senior management, for example, which I agree is, I think, a really key and challenging aspect of all of this. Yeah, definitely.
Choosing the priorities also, that's an interesting one. I guess I would suggest following the order of priorities that Fred was sharing, but indeed they are all equally important almost, so it's difficult to
I think they're all really important, and I think that we did think a while on the order, and I think it is conscious the order things are in the guidelines, so I would kind of follow it in order, because I think it's all important, but it did feel like this was a bit of a build. So, working at those foundational levels and then expanding outwards. It's not always perfect. It might be more difficult to, for example, do a lot of work around copyright and acquisitions before you've convinced your senior management that that's important, and that the stages come in the opposite order. So it's not a perfect science, but it kind of felt these are the important, the foundations felt really, really foundational. You can't get very far without the foundations, but you might find it differently. We'd really appreciate that feedback. I'm just looking at the chat, and there is a question in there about whether there are templates available that Glams can use to gather copyright information. And that's a really good question. There are, to an extent. I mean, there are pockets of sort of templates available in different places. And templates also for exchange and collaboration. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. We haven't made any templates, you know, it's a short answer in terms of a part of this. We've not sort of given a template policy, for example, or copyright, you know, acquisition sheet. However, that's a piece of work that we are planning to look at this year separately from this. The copyright community is planning to look at gathering together some either templates or examples. It may be as easy sometimes to find examples than templates, but of sort of copyright documentation. So thinking about policies and sort of paperwork and forms, and trying to take some work to gather those together in a sort of a bit of a resource bank, if you like. So we'll be working on that, because I think I agree that is a bit of a gap. I think you were going to say, that maybe if we leave this slide up for now, and I guess invite anyone at this point, if you do have other questions you wanted to ask or thoughts, to go ahead and unmute and ask, or pop it into the chat, and we can have a conversation at this point. Yeah, that's good to hear about the resource bank. Might be helpful. Yeah, that's something we're definitely keen to work on. It's a bit of work, because it's making sure we find things from different sort of types of the sectors and different types of organization. Make sure that we kind of think that the documentation is reasonable, and then obviously gathering it together, making sure we have permission to gather it together, and making sure it's sort of indexed and everything that's in a way that's useful. But yeah, we're really keen to work on that this year, because I think it would be quite helpful. And yeah, exactly, keeping it up to date is really difficult and sort of as challenging as well. So there's a problem there with the templates.
And I think that perhaps the biggest challenge is how to make them relevant across jurisdictions. And maybe some really good examples exist in specific countries, like organizations that support the cultural heritage there, but we're not necessarily aware of them. But I think, yeah, we can still try to gather some good examples or type of standards that can be maybe zoomed out a little bit to be relevant enough across languages and jurisdictions. And I was wondering, that question by Jane, were you also thinking about kind of copyright metadata fields other than, so what specific type of information to track in the moment an institution acquires the work? So, or templates, etc., were already to the job. And yeah, Marco, that's a good tip. Thank you.
Wow, that's good to know. So yeah, the Network for Collections Management and Contemporary Documentation in Finland is trying to come up with uniform templates or a resource bank for cultural heritage organizations in Finland. So that's excellent to know. So that's maybe something we could check out as well as part of these processes. But yeah, I think that chimes, look at, that's a fantastic resource and probably a really huge effort, but obviously is very Finnish specific. And yeah, Marco, that's a good point as well, language. Yeah, I think that's going to be a big challenge as well, as sort of applicability across borders. I'll be interested to see what we do with languages. Yeah. Yeah, legislation varies a lot, and I think that's part of the reason why we've kind of separated these two activities into a guideline that are very general and quite high level from activities around sort of templates and recommended documents, if you like, because this is really high level. It doesn't talk about specific legislation, for example. It talks about what we all have in common, which is common processes of a cultural heritage organization, in terms of the flows from acquisition to access and preservation, and the challenges of oftentimes digital and the realities of copyright. You know, we all have that, but we all, exactly as you say, you know, we have very different details within our copyright legislation or our public sector information legislation or our laws and practices around cultural organizations that make sort of detailed templates or specific you know, example guides quite a bit more challenging.
And yeah, Marco says that hopefully national agencies, I understand it as, can help us promote these guidelines. So, yeah, that would be really great, I think.
Yeah, the place where the most value of international and EU-wide collaboration and common templates resource banks is regarding licenses, yeah, which are not strictly that. Yeah, and that's true. And I think that licenses and copyright statements, exactly like CC, is one of the areas where we can see sort of more availability of templates. So things like Creative Commons are standardized internationally acceptable licenses. And you also have things like rightstatements.org, which does a similar-ish type of activity for standardized rights statements for communicating sort of the status of your rights in a harmonized way. So yeah, Mia's saying that it'd be really interesting to read more about risk management in relation to copyright management. Yeah, I think that's true, and I think we did, you know, I didn't focus on the risk section so much. I'd be interested to hear how that feels for people. And yeah, I'm trying to think of what sort of good resources to think about with risk and copyright are off the top of my head, but it's I think it's so fundamental, as I was saying earlier, to copyright management, because you're never going to have that perfect world of certainty. And when you've got uncertainty, you're going to have risk. And so I think it's understanding that, accepting that, and then agreeing how you're going to deal with it is so important. It's very trendy among fields of law at the moment. I think that speaks to the practicalities of it. You know, it's realizing we can't be, the laws are so vast and so complicated, it's not always possible to be so certain. So yeah. And Jane's saying, I think even general templates would be invaluable, and then we can work with national organizations. For example, I'm in Wales, we could look to cultural sector leaders. Yeah, definitely. There's a degree to which localization of sort of generalized templates might be helpful or possible. Well, maybe if we go on to the next slide, then if no one has any more detailed questions, I think we've got a slide that tells you how to get the guidelines. So yeah, there's that, and I'll just pop the link into the chat as well. So the guidelines, if you haven't already seen them, yeah, it's a PDF basically, and it's published on the Europeana Pro site, and there's a link there, or the QR code you can get there. So if there are any more questions or any more thoughts, we're very happy to take those for the next few minutes. Otherwise, it's already really valuable to hear the feedback. I mean, I think we're getting a lot of themes about it. It sounds like it's been very valuable, the work that we're going to do about templates. And it sounds like there's already some things for us to think about in terms of sort of the who and the when sort of sequencing with these recommendations we're making. So that's something for us to think about already. So thank you for that. But you're welcome to stay and ask any questions you've got or any further discussion. Otherwise, I wanted to thank you very much for coming today. And please do make use of the guidelines. Yes, thank you, Marco. Yes, let's all try. And we'd really, really, really welcome any feedback you've got at any point about them. If you find them not at all useful, if you never used them, if you found them very useful, and anything in between, just hearing that and knowing anything about it is very valuable to us. So yeah, getting in touch with us on social media or by email, please just let us know. Well, thank you very much, everybody.